The state can't give us transformative justice. Part 3. Whether Darren Wilson is indicted or not, the entire system is guilty. In these times, November 2014. Everyone I know is on edge. Will a grand jury in St. Louis indict or not? On one hand, how will residents of Ferguson react if, as many expect, the grand jury advises against an indictment of Darren Wilson, the officer who killed Mike Brown? What will be the response of the St. Louis and Ferguson police? Photos of MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush-protected police vehicles, and boarded-up businesses proliferate on social media. Articles suggest that St. Louis police have recently stockpiled riot gear and military-grade weapons. It's war, but that's not new. Everyone is holding their breath. On the other hand, what's next if the grand jury does decide that Wilson should stand trial? So much psychic, emotional, and spiritual energy is focused on a successful indictment. I imagine the sighs of relief. I anticipate the countless social media posts crying out justice. I imagine that many exhausted protesters will decide that their work is done. I fear a return to our seductive slumber and to complacency. I'm not interested in indicting Darren Wilson, though I understand its symbolic, in parentheses, import to many people, especially Mike Brown's family and friends. Vincent Warren of the Center of Constitutional Rights speaks for many, I think, when he writes, "Without accountability, there can be no rule of law. If Wilson is not indicted or is under-indicted, the clear message is that it is open season on people of color, that St. Louis has declared that Darren Wilson is not a criminal, but that the people who live under the thumbs of Darren Wilsons of this country are. It would say to the cry that Black Lives Matter that no, in fact, they do not." Excuse me. I understand the sentiment that Warren expresses, yet I don't believe that an indictment of Wilson would be evidence that Black lives do, in fact, matter to anyone other than Black people. Nor do I think that his indictment would mean that it was no longer open season on people of color in this country. If we're to take seriously that oppressive policing is not a problem of individual bad apple cops, then it must follow that a singular indictment will have little to no impact on ending police violence. As I type, I can already feel the impatience and frustration of some who will read these words. It feels blasphemous to suggest that one is disinvested from the outcome of the grand jury deliberations. Don't you care about accountability for harm caused? Some will ask. What about justice? Others will accuse. My response is always the same. I'm not against indicting killer cops. I just know that indictments won't and can't end oppressive policing, which is rooted in anti-Blackness, social control, and containment. Policing is derivative of a broader social justice. It's impossible for non-oppressive policing to exist in a fundamentally oppressive and unjust society. The truth is that, as the authors of Struggle for Justice wrote in 1971, without a radical change in our values and a drastic restructuring of our social and economic institutions, we can only achieve modest reforms of the criminal punishment system, including policing. And including policing is in parentheses. The pattern after police killings is all too familiar. Person X is shot and killed. Person X is usually Black or less frequently brown. Community members sometimes take to the streets in protest. They are sometimes brutally suppressed. The press calls for investigations. Advocates call for reform, suggesting that the current practices and systems are broken is in quotations, and or unjust. There is a, in parentheses, racist backlash by people who support the police. A very few people whisper that the essential nature of policing is oppressive and is not susceptible to reforms. Thus, only abolition is realistic. These people are considered heretics by most, and I've spent years participating in one way or another in this cycle. Knowing all of this, what can and should we do to end the oppressive policing? We have to take various actions in the short, medium, and long term. We have to act at the individual, community, institutional, and societal levels. For my own part, I start by never calling the cops. I hope more people will join me in that practice. It demands that we feel for the edge of our imaginations to stop relying on the police. It takes practice to do this. As such, we need popular education within our communities about alternatives to policing. I vocally and actively oppose any calls for increased police presence as a response to harm in my community and in my city. At budget time, I pay attention to how much money is allocated to law enforcement. I press my local elected officials to oppose any increases in that amount and to instead advocate for a decrease in the police department's budget. I support campaigns for reparations to police torture and violence victims. I support elected civilian police accountability councils and boards, knowing full well that they are band-aids, in parentheses. Let's see. I believe that we need grassroots organizations in every town and city that document and publicize the cases of people who have suffered from police violence. These organizations should use all levers of power to seek redress for those victims and their families. I list these actions with the understanding that together they aren't enough to end oppressive policing. They will lessen the harm, to be sure, but only building power amongst those most marginalized in society holds the possibility of radical transformation. And that's an endless quest for justice. That's a struggle rather than a goal. Only movements can build power. We need a movement for transformative justice. To the young people who have taken to the streets across the country and are agitating for some quote-unquote justice in this moment, I hope that you don't invest too deeply in the Ferguson indictment decision. Don't let a non-indictment crush your spirit and steal your hope. Hope is a discipline. And frankly, the actions you've taken and are taking inspire so many daily. On the other hand, a decision to indict Darren Wilson isn't a victory for justice or an end. As I've already said, an indictment won't end police violence or prevent death of another Mike Brown or Rekia Boyd or Dominique Franklin. We must organize with those most impacted by oppression while also making room for others who want to join the struggle too, as comrades. As Kwame Ture often said, we need each other. We have to have each other for our own survival. Take this admonition seriously. We should use the occasion of the indictment announcement to gather and continue to build power together. This is how we will win.